Good morning, everyone. So, before we proceed with our interview, we would like to introduce our speaker or our interviewee for today, Dr. Gail James. Dr. Gail James, as a program and development director from New Jersey, is renowned for her service and active participation in the nonprofit sector because of her dedication and commitment to advancing empowerment among women, especially among the marginalized groups by fostering and promoting education, equity, and social justice through her advocacy. Dr. Gail James received her BA in History and Political Science from Elmira College, New York, and her PhD in French Literature from the University of Arizona. Furthermore, she also studied abroad at the University of Paris for her junior year at Sorbonne. With respect to her academic background as a student, her academic career spanned 16 years as faculty and 20 years in administration for the position of Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs across several colleges. Distinctively, her passion and dedication to promote and harness both her professional and personal advocacy directed towards education, women's issues, and internationalism has been exhibited and further expanded through her participation in the nonprofit sector, from which she has been selected to serve on local and national boards of directors involving the Greater Kansas City's Women's Political Caucus, the Women's Foundation and Alliance. Moreover, Dr. Gail James is a founding member of the Women's Intercultural Network, a global forum, where she serves as a United Nations Delegate to the Commission on the Status of Women and is Vice President of U.S. Women Connect, a national network committed to implementing cities for CEDAW.
Good day, Dr. Gail James. To begin with, we as your interviewers, on behalf of our team for Cities for CEDAW, would like to express how awestruck and motivated we are by your legacy and academic background that is evidently grounded by the pertinence of putting forward the rights of women. Truly, you are an epitome and role model for a transformative form of civic engagement.
Well, thank you. And I say back to you, I'm very impressed with all of you. The more I get to see you and involve and see what you're involved in terms of CEDAW and women's rights, human rights, it is very commendable. But more than that, it's impressive, and it's a culmination of my career now that we're handing the torch over to you. So we're very proud to see you stepping forward and doing this work.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Gail James. To kickstart our interview and with respect to your influence and involvement in the promotion of your advocacies that are primarily centered on women's rights, we are interested to hear why you decided to devote yourself to CEDAW and how has this contributed to your discernment of what Cities for CEDAW is.
Well, it really, I would say, goes back to my youth and my childhood, in that my parents raised me to be a person, and not a wife and mother only as my focus, so that my pathway was open. And when I was in college and I met young women, girls coming from all over the country, all over the world, I realized that they had very different experiences, and that kept them from feeling as free, and that the world was theirs for them to explore. And so I feel it was a great advantage to be brought up as a person, as a human being, as opposed to a girl that I would have more limited choices. So that was an advantage. As I grew older and began an academic career, I realized also how the ceilings were not as open as I anticipated. And so it took me a short while to realize how important that step is to realize that we're all walking the planet and that we have to choose our pathways, but our pathways can be as broad as we make them. And it's partly vision, but it's also partly energy and commitment, and then your life experience, which lends you to experience the world as broadly as possible. And so the first board of directors that I took on had to do, when I lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I was a dean of a college, and I realized that women faculty were simply not given the same authority and responsibility or pay that men faculty had. And so that became my first effort to, as my role as a dean would be to speak for them and to create an equitable environment. And so that creates conflict. When you see issues that have differing perspectives as well as a history, and it gives you a sense of purpose, but it also embroils you in conflict. And that's how I learned that conflict resolution and mediation, and I recommend that to you, all of those of you who are studying international relations, take that on as a subject of study as well, to master some of those techniques, because that will help you a great deal. And later on, as I experienced my board work and my academic work and civic engagement, I realized that the UN, which was, since I'm from New Jersey, which, as you know, the UN is right there across the river, and you can see from the geography, I felt that the UN was in my backyard, so to speak, and that I grew up knowing what the UN was doing. But I did not know what they were doing with UN Women. And as UN Women was formed, not very long ago, actually, from different aspects of their engagement in the world, was brought together and formed UN Women a decade ago or so. I realized that I had to learn more about what UN was doing for women and how that would supplement my work. I also met a wonderful person, Marilyn Fowler, who brought me into her organization as a founding member of the Women's Intercultural Network. And she was the one who introduced me to Soon Young and was in the early stages of engaging with bringing CEDAW into the national environment of the United States, since the global treaty had not been signed, that there would be an effort to go grassroots level, to go right to where communities live. Because as you know, human rights, women's rights exist at the grassroots level. That's where we all live our lives, and it makes a difference how we access education, how we are in employment, and how our neighborhoods are safe, how our personal environments are affected by human rights right in our very neighborhoods. And so that interested me in not only CEDAW globally, but CEDAW as a national movement that would be brought into cities and counties across the country. And so that was in 2014, 2015. And so here we are now, not quite 10 years later, and we have between 50 and 70 cities that are engaged in some form of CEDAW activity locally, and in different municipalities, different jurisdictions, make a difference in how public policy is brought, human rights is entered into public policy. And this is very important because many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, the writings of Martin Luther King, who said, I can't stop you from hating me, but I can stop you from lynching me. And that because we can create laws that prevent lynching. And so these kinds of horrific acts can be dealt with on public policy as they're brought into resolutions and ordinances and laws across the country. This makes a significant difference. It doesn't change attitudes, but that takes much longer, as you know. But we have to change our laws so that they're fairer, they create safer environments for women and girls, and that means families, and that means everyone. And so that's really perhaps a long answer to my commitment to CEDAW and the kinds of work that we're all engaged in.
And in view of your transformative perspective on the participation of women, most especially in the political sector, we've heard that you were inducted into the Women's Political Hall of Fame. That said, we would like to know if in your commitment to advocating for an active civic engagement and participation among women with their respective communities and workplaces, have you ever participated in any Cities for CEDAW trainings during your experience with the UN? And in your opinion, were these important networking sources for your campaign?
Yes, I would say yes to that last question first, that yes, these are very important and very significant networking opportunities. And even more than that, it builds relationships and it builds commitments. The more people that you see engaged in these efforts, both men and women, mostly women at this point, but many, many men as well are engaged in this effort. And it builds relationships, which is what it takes to have success, to have any measure of achievement. It takes network building, relationship building, coalition building with individuals as well as with organizations and agencies. So it's very important to do that. I have been involved at a very grassroots level here in I live in Kansas City right now. And in Kansas City, we have engaged with the city of Kansas City, Missouri, and we now have a gender analysis. We have a gender equity task force. We almost have an ordinance in the fact that the city has chosen to enact several different ordinances, and with the understanding that next year they will be woven together in a more generic and fulfilled CEDAW ordinance. I also have engaged with local municipalities where they say, we don't need CEDAW, we're fine, we don't have problems. And you look at them and you say, but you have crimes, you have crimes against women, you have pay inequities, you have unsafe neighborhoods, unsafe conditions for women and girls. Many women and girls do not have access to education and employment opportunities. Isn't that true? Well, yes, but we do have that, but we're not really very much. And so we make the point, and this has been very effective, to say, how many discrimination cases have you had that cost the city millions and millions of dollars? And once you ask them to take a look at that, they see that discrimination is a cost and that it helps very much to begin to address it. Do the data collection, do the gender analysis, get a sense of the status of the well-being and safety of women and girls in your community, and then begin to address it. And that really helps cities take stock of where they are. I have seen many city council members be resistant, and yet I have seen others very receptive and open and interested, because many do want to improve their communities and are not defensive and are not resistant. So it really, but it takes a great deal of time, which I think is why I would say not every city in America or county in America is a CEDAW city or county yet, because it takes a long time to build knowledge, relationships, and trust and understanding of where this is going.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gail. Discernibly, your campaign is extensively and inclusively directed towards the promotion of the general public welfare. With that said, we are interested to hear your story about the initial phase of your campaign. Specifically, who did you first contact to start the campaign locally or in your organization? And could you give us a brief overview of the timetable from start to finish?
Oh, that's a big question, but I'll try to keep me on track if I get lost in some of the details, because it's very dear to my heart of how we did it. It's very fulfilling, but it's very painstaking, and if it were easy, all cities would be there, but it's a little difficult and complex. We started by building a women's equality coalition. A friend of mine and I started that in 2013, and here in Kansas City, Missouri, and there's also a Kansas City, Kansas, because we're on the state line. There's a metropolitan area, we call it, that encompasses 20 municipalities of both states. And so that meant our coalition was quite widespread and quite broad. All organizations that are invested and committed to the well-being of women and girls. Women's Foundation, University Women, Zonta International, League of Women Voters, the Women's Political Caucus, NAACP, and their women of color. We also had a Hispanic organization of Latina professional women. Their name was Latina Professional Women. And they also contributed to broadening and deepening our coalition. We worked for a year in working together in understanding each other, committing to a common agenda for CEDAW. My colleague Alice Kitchen, who couldn't join us tonight, although Soon Young offered the opportunity, she had another commitment, but she is someone that I think you might be interested in interviewing at some future point. She and I decided that we would then build into the city council. We organized meetings with city council members individually. We began with people we knew who were already on city council and who were in some of our organizations. And so we could build on those relationships. At that point, it was 2014, and Women's Intercultural Network, the Conference on Civil and Human Rights in Washington, and Soon Young, representing Commission on the Status of Women, NGO in New York City. That three-part commitment to launch Cities for CEDAW at CSW at the UN in 2014, then helped our organization. We came back from the UN in New York to our home and brought the proposal for a resolution to our city council. And because we had already established relationships and a trust, they enacted that immediately. They enacted it, a resolution. And as you know, a resolution is a statement of philosophy. It's a statement of support. It is not a legal document, but is something we treasure as a gateway to a CEDAW initiative, because it establishes a city committing itself to the principles of human rights for women and opportunities for women and girls, and to the larger purview of a CEDAW initiative. So that was very encouraging. And from that, in 2015, our mayor joined all the mayors in the US Conference of Mayors. All the mayors of the United States meet once or twice a year. And they also signed in 2015 a CEDAW resolution of support for CEDAW and the principles of elimination of discrimination against women in their cities. And that really was a launching for many cities to undertake a CEDAW initiative. And what we see is then we began to splinter. We began, that may not be the best word, but to open out into so many complex approaches to a CEDAW campaign. In some, it was enacted by mayors who launched an initiative. And that's what happened in Los Angeles, for example. That mayor, Mayor Garcetti, in 2016, initiated a CEDAW project by executive order. He said every department, and usually in the city, there might be from 10 to 30 departments. He said every department will do a gender study, will do an analysis of the inequities, the potential inequities that we might find, and then give me a plan to address these inequities and these problems that we may face. And there will be no new money. We will not give you a new allocation yet, because that will be another budget year. But what we will do is we would ask you to take a percentage of your existing budget. This is brilliant, because this forces the individual department, whether it's a public works or a legal department or a human resources department, to take a look at what it actually does and how it actually uses funds to improve the status of women. And this was very, very good. Now, in other cities, there's other approaches. in Kansas City, for example, the city council took ownership of the process. The finance committee took ownership of the process. Human resources, the employment sector, took ownership. So those three entities worked together to find a way to improve their gender inequities that the analysis showed in their employment. 2 years later, we had a gender study. We proposed that the university research department undertake the study. The city, however, chose to do an outside consulting firm, which cost a great deal more. But however, we did not have to raise the money. They paid for that. And so once the city does that, it takes ownership of the findings and also then wants to improve what it found with inequities in hiring, in compensation, in promotions, in departments led by women, and finally they created a balance in which male-female balance was created. And so we feel that that is something to be admired, that a gender study will lead to that kind of improvement. Now, other cities don't even have that measure of success. What they will do is they will say, no, now we have a new mayor, we have a new city council. And so that turnover, which is, as you know, every 2 years, every 4 years in every city, in every county, will affect the outcome of the CEDAW campaign. So that's another reason. One of my next articles will have to be on the reason why there's such inequity in the CEDAW campaign itself, because it's a very uneven process because of the political nature of councils and boards of supervisors in counties. Another city, for example, is a city like Boston, whom we're talking with right now, which is just at the early stages of a CEDAW campaign. And their mayor is very supportive. I met her on a Zoom that we, you never know whom you're going to meet on a given Zoom on a given day. The new mayor of Boston was there. I asked her if she would be interested in forwarding a CEDAW initiative. She said, yes, very much so, call my chief of staff. We did have great extensive meetings since then. And what they would like to do is set up a gender equity department and have that process run through that department. So that would mean that the city council and the mayor herself would have less of a role in directing the process, but a gender equity initiative within the city would have more longevity when that mayor leaves, that would be embedded in the city structure. So that's a different approach. Here in Kansas City, I'll come back to my own experience, which is that we've had many, I started by giving you the successes, 2015, 2014, 2015, 2016, and here we are in 2022, and we still are working on the gender analysis, the outcomes of the gender analysis. We're still working on the formation of the purview of the Gender Equity Task Force that was set up. And we were given the autonomy, however, and this is a very important achievement. We were given the autonomy to decide whether we wanted a commission on the status of women with members appointed by the city council, or a gender equity task force where we could decide, our coalition could decide the membership. And we chose the latter. And can you guess why? What would you think? Well, think about ownership and autonomy. If the city council chooses members, we don't know who they are, and we don't know their commitment to women's issues, women's well-being, women's rights. Whereas we have a little more autonomy now in deciding the membership and the diversity and the way it sets its planning strategically going forward. So we felt that that was a plus. Now, in other cities, we always want a commission on the status of women because that's a very important entity through the United Nations as well as across the country. But in this case, you know, you have to think strategically what is really best for you and your coalition going forward. And so that's how we decided that entity to be structured. And what we got in return is a budget and some support, some very simple committee support, so that we can have, we can call hearings, we can have findings, and we feel that that gives us a great deal of autonomy, and we'll be reporting back to our CEDAW, Cities for CEDAW campaign, how that's working. In terms of my own experience with other cities, I would say I'll give you just two more examples and then I'll turn it back to you, which is that when I mentioned resistance, I mean very often cities are very resistant to granting us. In fact, that's probably why we have a reluctance to sign the treaty in the US Senate, which is that the giving of human rights to people, whatever marginalized group, or whether it's gay, lesbian, and other gender identities, marginalized people, the disabled, and then if you put women, elder women, young women, in those groups, there's a loss of control and power that entities experience, and they do not want to give that easily. So you need to find and take time to establish good relationships with your allies throughout city government. And that means, so because we had some setbacks and because there was a fair amount of resistance, we found many allies at different levels of government, outside of city council, in agencies that are more permanent. They don't lose their seat every 2 or 4 years, so that people in human resources, people in the legal department, people in on the Human Rights Commission, all of those allies really helped move us forward. When we met with the San Diego County Commission recently, and I spoke on behalf of CEDAW ordinance for them, there was a tremendous pushback from on the transgender issue, on other women's issues, the abortion issue, and there's a great deal of resistance that will come up, as we understand it, from a concerted campaign to keep human rights from being encapsulated into a legal system. I spoke also recently in Washington, DC, in their recent proposal to have a CEDAW ordinance. Their city council was very receptive, asked very good questions, and less resistance. In other words, it's a difference in enlightenment, it's a difference in vision, and also it's a difference in relationship building that takes place over time. So that really helps, even though it is difficult to wait for a long time to have CEDAW move forward. It is worth the time that you spend developing your relationships. Did that answer your question adequately?
Yes, thank you for that, Doctor. And based on the interconnectedness of your previous answers, it was accentuated how essentially at the core of your campaign, organizational development, building networks, and training young women emphasizes the significance of prompting and preserving a collaborative and non-hierarchical commitment for the coming together of diverse groups of women. Having said that, what for you were the most important milestones for the campaign?
Important milestones would be, I think, starting right back at the very beginning, to have the U.S. Conference, it's called, U.S. Conference of Mayors, endorse the CEDAW initiative in 2015. And in fact, it's time now to go back, because there are hundreds and hundreds of new mayors, of course, during the political process over the last 5 to 7 years. It's time to go back to them and ask now for another form of endorsement to see, and we have mayors in our camp now who are CEDAW mayors, who can go now and take that message forward. And we've asked them, and they are willing to do that at their next meeting. I think their next one is in January. And so we will, that's a milestone. And the next endorsement, whether they issue a new resolution or whether they have some other form of a more concrete strategic initiative to join with us into, I'm not sure what that will look like, but it's time to go back to them and do that. And secondly, another great milestone is when the efforts made in California right now, the state of California, which already has a number of CEDAW cities and commissions on the status of women, and they initiated, a new challenge to say, let's have more cities, let's have more officials, let's have more counties engage in CEDAW work, in building their own commissions on the status of women. Let's focus on women in the state. And that as a state initiative is a very great model and very exciting because it creates incentives and it motivates people. So that's another great milestone. I would say also here in Kansas City, when we finally, this will sound funny since I've spent time explaining how important it is over time to be patient and make relationships and build coalitions. Yet what we found is we had a totally new person come into the city government, a young woman lawyer who took over the city manager job, and she just made it happen. She was new, we didn't know her, she didn't know us, but she liked it. And she liked what we were doing. She liked what we gave her some incentives to read our materials, and she just moved it forward. So that is a great accomplishment, unanticipated, because she was new to the city and to the initiative. But sometimes it takes that to be open to something new happening, and that enabled us then to engage with the Human Rights Commission in a new way and bring our coalition under that and under their aegis, and then have our own gender equity task force. So things like that can happen.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gail. To further expound on the critical need for a collaborative and non-hierarchical commitment, albeit diversity, we would like to know more about your involvement with Cities for CEDAW, encompassing questions like how often did you meet, did you hold public hearings, and lastly, did you have contact with other cities that passed CEDAW legislature?
Yes, well, we have the Cities for CEDAW campaign has a structure that's extremely broad and loose, actually, in that there's no head of CEDAW, Cities for CEDAW. I'm coordinating at the moment, but what that means is that we try to keep a contact list of who is engaged in CEDAW initiatives at any level. Through the League of Women Voters, for example, or Azanta International, who is leading an inquiry and any research and any activity into CEDAW. And it comes from many different sectors. Then we keep that list, our contact list, and we try to do a report every year. We're working on a report this year so that we can send it out to everyone, so we can see what is happening in Bozeman, Montana, what's happening in Toledo, Ohio, and now, as I just mentioned, in Boston, a new initiative. And so we try to keep track of that. However, I will say, excuse me, the difficult part of that is that if a city is starting a CEDAW initiative, we may not know about it until it moves along a little bit, until we hear about it. So in that way, a city like Madison, Wisconsin, which is a huge university environment, had a new CEDAW initiative that we hadn't heard about until we were engaged in another enterprise, and that came about, and we learned about what was happening there, and the same in Fairfax, Virginia. So our structure needs improvement so that we can always know what's happening on the ground at the grassroots level. But when you have a loose structure, it doesn't lend itself to constant information. So we need better information gathering and a record keeping. And that's what we're working on this year. That's our goal for this year. And along those lines, we have a CEDAW advisory group. And these are people, senior people who have experience with CEDAW, either at the global or national levels, to advise us on a strategic plan. And that's really essential. And then also we have quarterly meetings. We do not have monthly meetings. We have quarterly meetings. They are open to anyone interested starting a CEDAW initiative or already established, that they can give best practices to other cities and answer questions. We also have some local, as I mentioned, there's a CEDAW California. The state of California has its own initiative now. We have started here a Midwest CEDAW, Midwest for CEDAW, we call it, because Midwest Coalition, because you may not know the cultural pulls in the United States, but when you're in either coast, the East Coast or the West Coast, it's considered to be different from what's happening in the center of the country, which is slightly more, maybe less diverse. But in truth, it's a very diverse environment. And so we're trying to improve the way the Midwest, which includes all of our cities that we've been talking about in Ohio, Illinois, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, et cetera. And so we're working on that to improve how the Midwest interprets a CEDAW initiative. So we do not have weekly, monthly meetings, but rather we have quarterly meetings and we have advisory meetings. And we have as many Zooms with people who are interested as you. So we have met recently or joined the UN Women Town Hall on Cities for CEDAW, the California Challenge Initiative, as well as the Ratify Initiative, which I think some of you have been engaged with as well. So we're really trying to be more responsive to what's happening out there. And also thirdly, I would say most importantly is the resources that we offer. What we say is that we want to be resourceful and help cities, because there are always so many questions and always so many setbacks, and how we can help each other learn from our experiences and best practices. So our resource page, our website needs to be improved, and we're working on that. That's our second strategic element right now, is to improve that and to find the resources that we need to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Gail. In relation to the challenges and strategic elements you have mentioned, aside from where you were able to get the encouragement to overcome such obstacles, we would like to know as to what were the important resources you were able to utilize to get further support on your campaign. Were you able to participate often in national meetings? And did you get support from international NGOs besides the one you belong to, as well as local groups and state leaders?
Well, that's a very good question. The resources that are helpful are the other examples we have. We try to keep track of templates, to set up templates so that we have models of resolutions and ordinances and reports. And they are very helpful, because what we have to know about this campaign is that every city has to decide and design its process slightly differently, given its climate, its cultural and political climate and its needs. So looking at what other cities have done is very important. So those resources have been really important. Secondly, our great mentors like Soon Young and Krishanti Demaraj, who are great educators, have been very resilient for us and always unflagging in their support and meeting us on Zooms to give information. to set up meetings with us and to answer any questions and to give us insight and perspective. That has been very helpful. The international organizations, yes and no. What they do is provide models. What we like is that their support for Zanta International, for example, which is quite forward-looking and always identifies issues every year or every other year on what they're going to work on. They are always interested in issues relating to women and girls, whether it's child marriage or violence against women. And they help us a great deal by offering their insight and their perspective. Another organization is a new organization in the United States, which is called US Women's Foreign Policy, to set up a feminist foreign policy, which gave us insight, although we're working in domestic policy and not foreign policy and not diplomacy. But what it did, that organization invited us in, all of us working in this field, to help them sort out and strategize, prioritize about what really are women's issues and how is it different from other forms of engagement in the world, whether you're dealing on global terrain in diplomacy or on the ground in your home community. So that was very helpful because it gave us tremendous insight, and it showed two things. One is that we're all working in this together, even though we have differing a focus, maybe a different focus, a different platform, but we are all on the same side. And then in addition to that, it gave us, I think, an insight into how we can proceed in dealing with the challenges that I mentioned earlier, that I keep mentioning, because these challenges are real. And in order to confront the challenges, you need support and some ideas of how to build your own resilience and to also address these challenges. So for example, one of our coalition members, which is called the US Women's Caucus at the UN, which is a relatively new organization of 3 or 4 years, but has established itself with the US mission at the UN and has now quite a track record in addressing women's issues globally. But what that organization decided to do, let's take a deep breath and let's look at who are the women and what are the women's groups that are opposed to CEDAW and to women's rights and to the kinds of issues we're talking about. Who are they? What is it they believe? How do they establish themselves as a voice? And how can we deal with that? How do we confront that? Because they're real. They vote against our issues oftentimes, and we have to know who they are. And so that was very instructive. So an organization that was willing to do that research and to find political scientists and other officials who are engaged in those in the study of what we call in America, we call conservative women, but it also is just those opposed to our initiatives on a local level. We learned a great deal of who they are and what their thoughts are and what their motivation is. And we learned that it has to do with patriarchy, and it has to do with a form of white nationalism, which means that what we learned is that this is bigger than we thought. These are huge cultural schisms in a given time that we're living in now. And so in order to be able to address these things, we have a lot of work to do to build, if not bridges to these people, at least understandings among ourselves of how we can keep going and not be disappointed when we don't win every battle. And so I found that one of the most instructive things I've been engaged in lately, because it was very, very interesting and very helpful, a little daunting and overwhelming, because you mentioned my academic career. I would say as a student of history and a student of literature and an academic, and I like to learn things, what you learn is that history is very difficult and can be very cruel and doesn't always go in the way that we would like individually. And so it helps to understand what you're dealing with at the deepest level, and yet to keep going, because that's the only way we can manage to stay afloat, so to speak. So those kinds of things were very helpful. And I'll mention one more thing, which is as you look at the resources you have available, what I have found is that there's always something new to learn, always some new place to turn to get information, to get support. And even though we are not in the place we would like to be as women and girls facing, it's your future, but we would like to help you, but we know we have to pass the torch on to you. And we know that we have to give you the most incentive we can to keep you going. So that's what I'm trying to leave at this latter part of my career, is to do that. And I'm finding that daunting again, and also, but worth doing. But I'm finding resources everywhere where we can find help for each other. That went off a little bit.
Thank you for that, Doctor. And as we focus more on the process of your advocacy itself with regard to Cities for CEDAW, did you feel that the campaign was strong enough to really take an effect with your target community? And were there any controversies regarding the language, may it be in terms of gender and sex, as well as women's rights as you were implementing your campaign?
I think that's a very good and strong question. Yes, if you're really honest, you say, well, I wish we had started differently. Perhaps looked at the UN language and transferred that to language that most people in a given urban rural area of the United States would understand, because that has been a great challenge, is that is an obstacle that we've had to face, is that translating UN language, treaty language into the language that people understand. And that alone, but we persist. In other words, we have chosen as an entity not to change CEDAW. We keep that as our acronym and explain it each time to people, that it is a convention for the elimination, et cetera, of all forms of discrimination against women, and that there's really no way around it. That's what we want to call it. But that can be a problem in terms of the language used and the way people uptake it, the way people experience it, is that the UN is telling a given city what to do. So that's the second piece of what a problem can be, that we wish perhaps we ought to have had a little more time understanding that and how to get around that. Now, one of the best things we have in our resource arsenal is the workbook by Krishanti Dimaraj, called Making Rights Real. And if you haven't read that, I would recommend that highly, because it's a step-by-step primer, point-by-point book on how to do CEDAW. And she addresses all these issues, which they did in San Francisco in the late 90s. So we use that as a guidebook. And they did handle all these issues. But for the average city, it's very difficult to do it in that way exactly. And so those are kinds of things I wish we had planned for a little bit better, to make the transference, the translation of from concept to practice. As you know, and you will see that in your studies as well, is that moving what we call from logos to praxis, from the idea of something to the actual thing itself in motion as a reality, is very difficult.
Thank you, Dr. Gill. For the last question, considering that the Women's Intercultural Network, or WIN, is a co-architect of the city's first CEDAW campaign, we wanted to know, as a founding member of WIN and as a vice president of US Women Connect, how does WIN and other organizations who share the same sentiments with your advocacy measure the impact of the city's first CEDAW campaign? Do you have any future plans in relation that to what can further strengthen and widen the scope of your campaign, and how do you plan on achieving these goals?
Yes, I hear three questions in there. So I will start with, yes, WIN and its other organizations, its sister organizations, is engaged right now and has been in the last 3 to 6 months in strategically looking at how we can gauge the impact. And of course, Sun Young has been very helpful in that, in asking us to think about how we do, how the research is done and who is doing it and what that would be, what that would look like as that comes forward into the public sphere. We have to do that because it's been in place 2014 to 2022. So we're almost by 10 years in 2024. We want to have, our goal is to have a real impact study of what has changed in the cities and counties. And we have 2 or 3 or 4 states actually that have CEDAW resolutions, and California has an ordinance. So what we really want to do is have that, and that is painstaking because we really don't have a staff and we don't have much funding. So that is our biggest, those are our challenges. But that needs to be done, because if we don't do that, we won't have the data and the analysis of the campaign itself to show that this is impactful, because we say it's impactful, we say it's significant and meaningful, and will be, as if to a city, if you will undertake this, it will be impactful. But now we have to show what cities are actually doing. And so we have a new, we've done our normal survey this spring, and of the cities engaged, and we will have a report coming out of what they've told us in the probably early fall. But before that happens, we've started another survey on, instead of what we ask cities is, what are you doing lately? What have you done since we last heard from you last year? What's new? What are you working on? Those kinds of general questions, just so we know what the activity level is. But our advisors have advised us, what we would like is, what specifically has a given city done that's shown to be significant? So we're asking the cities, send us 1 or 2 or 6 major accomplishments that you have done in the last, since the inception of your CEDAW initiative, and tell us how you know the impact. So I'll give you an example, which would be what we would anticipate is a city like Los Angeles has started a new program with girls' education and the fire department. As you may or may not know, but fire departments are notorious for being not very gender friendly, and also not looking at employment opportunities for women. So this is girls. We're encouraging them to stay in school, at the city of Los Angeles, I should say, to stay in school, to work and to find ways that they could engage with fire department, both in technical ways and in actual practical ways, that they may be interested in these careers that have to do with dangerous employment. And that has been a public-private sector funded project. So we know that that's an accomplishment. What we want to know is, from that cohort of girls who entered into that initiative, how many have in fact stayed? How has it affected both employment and culture of a fire department, which is very male dominated? And so that's an example that we're looking forward to seeing how that would work and what it would look like as a model for other cities. Another example would be here in Kansas City, and I'll leave this. This is a very helpful example, I think, very small example. We asked the city council to create an ordinance under the CEDAW aegis that would force landlords to not evict women when they're in domestic violence situations, because as you know, they cause problems. There's all kinds of problems caused by that. Women are the victims of such things, and yet they're often evicted and they're left on the street, and they add to the homeless population with their children. It's just a dreadful situation. We ask that that not happen, that the city work with landlords and stop the eviction process. And so that happened. They did pass an ordinance. So that creates safety for women. It creates, so that's an accomplishment that's very small, but is an example of how this discrimination that takes place on a daily basis in a neighborhood can be addressed. So I'm very hopeful.
Wow, indeed, the wisdom and experiences that you have shared with us today really created an impact and further motivated all of us to continue to strive for the advancement of women's rights locally and globally. On behalf of our team for Cities for CEDAW, we would like to take this opportunity to extend our sincere appreciation and gratitude to you, Dr. Gail James, for
Thank
the
you.
time and effort that you have shared with us in today's session. It was a great it was great listening to your views and comments on your advocacy and the Cities for CEDAW campaign. Your insights on the process as well as the implementation of the campaign serve as a lesson for all of us. And this certainly raised the need for further awareness and action regarding implementing CEDAW in our communities as a way to also resolve the discrimination, violence, inequality, and other injustices that are still being immensely experienced by women across the world. And we certainly look forward to hearing more from you on related discussions and topics in the near future. Thank you so much,
Thank
Doctor.
you so much. Thank you, everyone. I know we will meet again. Thank you, my Soon Young, and we will meet again, all of you. Thank you very much. Good luck in your futures as well. We will meet again.